So good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon to the directors of CCGI, Kamala and team, my fellow panelists, and all of you wonderful people on today. It certainly is a pleasure spending this time with you. And today in this session, we are talking about board leadership. And particularly over the last few months, we would have heard it, and even in this environment, we keep hearing the word crisis in reference to the ongoing pandemic. But today I want to submit for your consideration, at least over the next few minutes, that perhaps the real crisis and even the less apparent one may not necessarily be the pandemic, but that of persons in positions of leadership who may not be apt for the position, who may not know how to lead, what is leadership, or even its far-reaching and sometimes irreversible impact. The thing about leadership is that it occurs even when the leader is unaware or if it's unintentional, because leaders replicate themselves. They produce after their own kind. In fact, there is an instructive piece of research done in 1987 by one Mr. Benjamin Snyder. I don't know if anyone heard about it or familiar with his research on the ASA cycle. And I would share a bit on that. This particular cycle, he used it to show how organizations and the people in those organizations start to become homogeneous with their leaders. A is for attraction, S is for selection, and the second A is for attrition. Now, what Snyder suggests is that organizational leaders, through the company's image, the communication, and what they put out in the public domain, attract persons to themselves, potential employees, investors, persons for the board, all sorts of different persons similar to themselves, or at least there is goal congruence. And then let me look at the employee portion. During the recruitment process, these leaders who also drive and shape the recruitment select people who are similar to themselves. And I can tell you what happens over time, and you guys will know, once you're in an organization, and you recognize that the attitudes, the behaviors, and the goals of the leaders doesn't align with your own, you feel forced out, you feel stifled. And then what happens in the end is that you're left with a homogeneous group of people within that organization. And when we consider this, consider the replicative power of leadership. And you don't have aware that you're a leader. You don't have to deliberately lead to do that. You will, if it is, sometimes an inaction is an action. So even nothing is something. So even when the leaders are not in tip-top shape, they replicate after their own kind. And what you would recognize is that the board would attract a CEO that it can work with, similar to itself. The CEO would attract executives similar to himself or herself. And it goes on and on and on. And interestingly, before I kind of pull the whole thing together, Harvard University also did some research on the contagious behaviors of organizational leaders. Those are where my thoughts are around. Contagious behaviors of organizational leaders and their impact on organizations. And there are some behaviors that are considered most highly contagious. And there are 8 clusters of them, but I'll just touch on 3. Strategy skills, integrity and honesty, and global perspective. And if 3 out of these 8 behaviors, highly contagious behaviors of leaders, in order for any of these behaviors to exist within the organization, it must start at the top leader level. It must start at the board level. So what does all of this tell us? This tells us that these elements and behaviors that we want to see in our organization, the adaptability, the flexibility, the agility, that those behaviors that are necessary to survive and thrive in this pandemic or this crisis environment, it will not exist if it doesn't exist within the leaders. It will not exist within the organization. Leaders who are in leadership positions, let me put it that way. Leaders who are in leadership positions but are not familiar with leading. There are persons on boards who are just there to meet the quota to get their stipend. When we ask the question, how do you actively contribute to what the organization is accomplishing? It's very difficult now in a time of crisis to look for that within the organization. So what I want to see is that leadership is critical and it must start at the board. The board must display the behaviors, the attitudes it wants to see within the organization. And there are two key leaders, the leader of the board and the leader of the staff. So you have the chairman and you have the CEO. And we can look at everybody else, but these two persons are absolutely critical if it is an organization is to surmount any crisis. And dealing with a rogue CEO is quite easy, because the board manages the performance of the CEO. But what happens with the performance of the chairman? Who manages that? Who controls, a runaway chairman or a rogue chairman? So there's so many discussions when it comes to board leadership. If you look at the public sector, I know the focus today is private sector, but if you look at the public sector, in the NGO sector, the chairman, critical people, who controls that? And are the control mechanisms that are supposed to be there, are they working? Are we ensuring that our leaders are leading effectively? And when we put all of this together, we can see clearly that the buck stops with the board. The board must possess and demonstrate what they want to see within the organization. If a board is resistant to change, there's no way you're going to find adaptability within the organization. And so to me, the real crisis may be leaders in positions that are not ready or willing or unable to have the capacity to lead. Because once they're able to lead, they could surmount this and any other crisis that may present itself. So that's where I would start for today. And that's where I would leave it until a little later. I'll give my fellow panelists some opportunity to contribute as well. Thank you.